Welcome back, everybody, or if this is your first time, welcome. Today I'm going to talk about exposure. I've been talking to quite a few people that want to get away from automatic settings on their cell phones or on their cameras, and exposure is probably the first thing that you need to consider when you're getting away from letting the camera manage everything for you. I'm going to do a series of entry-level videos covering the basics of cameras here over the next little while, interspersed with the other stuff that I'm working on. So what is exposure? Exposure is about how you manipulate three variables in your camera to get a picture that has highlights, midtones, and shadows that look realistic and like the scene that you're capturing. Those three variables are ISO, or film speed if you're shooting film, and then we have aperture and we have shutter speed. Aperture is kind of hard to wrap your mind around lots of times for beginners, but it is a ratio of the focal length to the inner diameter of the aperture of the lens. You don't need to remember that. What you do need to remember is the aperture inside the lens determines how much light gets to the sensor. The more open the aperture, the more light hits the sensor. And then as you close down that aperture, you can get less and less light to the sensor. And a lot of people wonder, why wouldn't I just shoot wide open all the time, or with the biggest aperture that I can all the time? And that's a great question, and it actually has an answer. So there's two reasons. One, as aperture size increases, depth of field decreases. And depth of field is the distance from the lens that is in acceptable focus. So if you've seen a portrait where the person is in sharp focus, but the background is dreamy and out of focus and blurred, that is usually done with a telephoto lens with a very open aperture. And then conversely, if you look at a landscape picture and everything's in sharp focus, that's usually a constricted aperture, a smaller opening inside of the lens that gets more and more in sharp focus. So aperture is written as a F, a front slash, and a number. The lower the number, the more light is coming into the camera and the shallower the depth of field. So if you've seen f2.8 or f16, f16 is a very small aperture and a lot is going to be in focus, where f2.8 is a relatively small aperture and much less is going to be in focus. The second reason that we don't shoot wide open all the time, this is more of a problem with vintage lenses than modern lenses, but it's still, most lenses have this problem, or this feature. On most lenses, as you decrease the aperture, you get slightly sharper. And there's a point where that stops working, but if you're shooting wide open, usually it's not quite as sharp as it would be slightly stopped down. So for most folks, if I have a lens that opens all the way to 1.8, it may not be super sharp, particularly in the corners at 1.8. If I stop it down to 2.8, reducing the light hitting the sensor, usually I gain sharpness as the trade-off. So to illustrate how the aperture works, I've got a vintage lens here, and we're going to switch to a top-down view here in just a second. And we'll be able to see the mechanical aperture actually opening and closing. In this shot, we're looking down through a vintage telephoto lens sitting on my light table. This lens allows me to change the aperture manually. At first, the lens is wide open with an aperture of f2.5. As I turn the control ring, the aperture gets smaller as the aperture blades move to make the opening smaller. This lens closes down to f32, which is a very small aperture. And I'll open and close the aperture a few times just so you can see how the blades change shape to allow more or less light in. Okay, so that kind of illustrates the mechanics of what's happening. Now to show you an actual example of that, here is 3 shots of my wife's piano, and with increasingly small apertures. So I'll walk you through what the aperture setting is and the impact that has on the final picture. So we've got a few shots of the piano here. All of these are taken with the same focal point, which is some of the near keys. At f2.8, which is a large aperture despite being a small number, you have to remember it's backwards. At 2.8, the maker and all but the nearest keys are out of focus here. When we move to the image shot at f4, more of the keys are now in focus, and the maker's name is more clear. When we get to the relatively small aperture of f8, most of the keys are in focus now, and the maker's name is very clear. This illustrates how changing the aperture can impact depth of field. So the next variable that we can change is shutter speed, which is physically how long the shutter is open and how long it's gathering light. The slower the shutter speed, the more light hits the sensor. The faster the shutter speed, the less light hits the sensor. And they're measured in fractions of a second. So if you see a shutter speed of 60, it's actually 1 over 60. It's 1/60th of a second is how long the shutter stays open. If you see 2000, it's 1 over 2000. So a very, very fast shutter. It's not open for very long. The reason we don't shoot at a slow shutter speed all the time to let a lot of light in is because of motion blur. The longer the shutter is open, the more likely something moving in the frame will be blurred, or your own movement, if you're hand holding, will be apparent by blurring everything. So if you're shooting a race car, you're gonna need a really fast shutter speed. If I'm shooting an architectural shot from a tripod, I can get away with a much slower shutter speed. There are reasons that maybe I want motion blur. If I'm taking a picture of that race car and I want to make it look like it's going really fast, maybe I want a slightly slower shutter speed. But if I'm taking a picture of an eagle flying overhead, I probably don't want that blurred. I probably want it in pretty sharp focus, so I'd have to use a much faster shutter speed. To illustrate this, first I'll tell you a story. When I was first getting trained in photography, one of my instructors sent us out on a project, and it was to capture a train and show motion. There's two approaches to this. I found a train yard that had a lot of trains coming and going, and I stood in the safe space that I was allowed to be in, focused on where a train would be. And my first shot was with the camera on a tripod. And as the train came by, I had a relatively slow shutter speed, and the resulting photos showed a blurred train going by in a still background. So that had the effect of showing that the train was moving very fast. The second way I approached it was to handhold, same slow shutter speed, and pan with a point on the train as it went by. And what this does, it takes a little practice and you have to a little repetition will get you a good result. But what it does, if you do it right, is freeze the train and get a sharp train, and the background looks like it's moving really fast. And I think that's a really neat effect. It makes it look like you're moving along with the train, and the train is going very fast. To illustrate that in a visual way, I've got 4 pictures of my wife's metronome shot at the swinging arm is always going the same speed, but I shot it at 4 different shutter speeds to show you how we progressively freeze motion. At 1/30th of a second, the moving metronome arm is quite blurred. This wouldn't be a great aperture for anything that was moving quickly through a scene. By 1/60th of a second, the blur is a little bit better, but it's still quite noticeable. For hand holding, this is usually a good shutter speed unless you're using a telephoto lens. So if you're taking a picture of architecture or something where there wasn't a lot of movement, this might be okay. When the speed is boosted all the way up to 1/250th of a second, the arm is almost frozen in time, and the blur is there, but it's not quite as noticeable. When we get to 1/1000th of a second, the metronome arm doesn't appear to be moving at all. Faster shutter speeds like this are great for shooting any kind of like car races, animals in motion. With birds, sometimes you have to go a lot higher than this to freeze them in motion because they're going so fast. Anything where you want to freeze motion, higher shutter speeds are good. It's just cutting down a lot on the amount of light that's going to get to the sensor. The last major variable is ISO. And ISO is the relative sensitivity of the film or the sensor to light. It's expressed in a number. If you have an ISO speed on film and an ISO speed on digital, in theory they should be the same. Sometimes manufacturers aren't exactly perfect with getting their cameras tuned that way, maybe film too. But in general, 200 speed film and an ISO of 200 should yield you about the same result exposure-wise. As the number grows, you get more sensitive to light. As the number shrinks, you get less sensitive to light. So then people will ask, well, why wouldn't I shoot with a high-speed film or a high ISO then, so I get more light? Both in film and in digital photography, higher ISOs come with noise. In film, it's larger grain structure that you can see, and in digital photography, usually it's color noise, which show up as little random flecks of color in your picture. And they can be very distracting, and I've got an example coming to show you that. Now, sometimes in film photography, there are still directors, actually for like cinema film, there are still directors that shoot actual film and not digitally. And in lower light situations, sometimes the grain is really pronounced. And I think it's kind of beautiful. So if you want that effect and you're shooting film, you certainly can use higher speed film. But generally you want to shoot at the lowest ISO you can get away with. Now, sometimes I can't shoot at the base ISO of the camera. The camera that I'm recording this on has a base ISO of 200. One of my other cameras has a base ISO of 100. And if I'm shooting at dawn or dusk and I'm doing like wildlife photography, usually there's just not enough light to both freeze the subject and get a good exposure. So I'm going to have to boost the ISO. Sometimes I can deal with that in post if there's a little noise. Sometimes in the right situations, noise isn't too distracting. So you kind of have to get a feel for what you're after and what you can get away with different kind of medium. So I've taken 3 photos of a color chart against a black background, and we'll run through those here real quick. At an ISO of 200, the colors on my color chart and the background are relatively noise-free, and everything looks pretty nice. When we boost the ISO all the way to 6400, which is fairly high, there's a lot of visible color noise, particularly in front of the color chart, but also in the black there's a fair amount of noise. When we boost it to 25,600, which I don't recommend doing, that's a really extremely high ISO, even on the best cameras. That's going to be a bit gritty. This looks pretty terrible. If it was a once-in-a-lifetime shot and it was the only way to shoot it, maybe I'd go this high. But this is a pretty terrible amount of noise, and it's going to look pretty awful in most situations. A couple more concepts before we wrap up. Your camera has a meter. And sometimes it's a little bar with a plus and minus and a 0 in the middle. Sometimes it's just a number with a minus or a plus in front of it. And it shows you 0 is where you want to be according to the camera. That is a perfect exposure. And then if you want to overexpose, you want positive numbers. If you want to underexpose, you go to the negative. And there are 3 different major ways the camera measures that light. There's evaluative metering, where it's looking at the entire scene. There's center weighted metering, where it measures the entire scene, but it weights the center of the image more. And that can be useful if you've got a subject that's brighter or darker than the surrounding environment, but you still want to take both into account. And then there's spot metering, which really just, it's a very small amount at the middle of the sensor or the film that's getting measured. It's measured against something called middle gray. And middle gray is kind of that. It's a not too dark, not too light gray color. And if you average out most scenes, it kind of ends up about there exposure-wise. And it works most of the time, but not always. If I'm out on a mountain covered in snow and taking pictures of people skiing, it's usually there's just a lot more light hitting the sensor. And if I don't want to underexpose everything, I have to overexpose according to what the meter says. Or if I've got people in an environment like I'm in right now with a really dark background, my camera thinks this shot is really underexposed. I had to adjust that so they don't try to get gray out of that background and really super overexpose me. In practical terms, you're going to have to balance how deep the depth of field you want. How much do I want to freeze motion? Am I shooting something that's fast that I want frozen? Or am I shooting something slow where it really doesn't matter? How much color noise can I accept? Do I need to bring a tripod to compensate for my own movement? And that, I just encourage you to get out and shoot. Reading books, watching videos is great. Then you have to go apply it to actually learn it and cement it in your mind. So hopefully that was super helpful. If you have any questions, comments, or anything like that, please leave them in the comment section below. And if you found this super useful, please subscribe. My name is Jeff. I'm an artist, photographer, and videographer full-time, and I do videos about those 3 subjects and a little bit of motivation and some information on navigating the art world as I do so myself. And good luck in your art journey, and good luck with your photography. We'll see you next time.